Hey guys, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is lecture 8 of grade 2, and we're going to continue our journey today in the realm of facing bets. We introduced at the end of lecture 7 the bluff catching system, the framework for thinking about how to separate your hands when facing a bet between 3 rough categories and then 3 more specific categories when you have a so-called bluff catcher. Today, we're going to elaborate more on this system, show you in detail how to split your range up using it in an array of different spots where you face aggression. As the bluff catching system mainly works on the turn and the river, those are the streets we're going to concentrate on today. To start with, I'm going to show you a spot where bluffing is actually quite counterintuitive and difficult to do. In many situations, bluffing is quite simple and easy, and you can hit the required bluff frequency or even exceed it if you're not careful very easily, and this is because your range just contains a natural propensity of air hands. For example, when you're on the button to open in big blind calls, and you fire a couple of times on a low, disconnected runout, it's very probable that your range will contain overcards, misdraws, of various varieties which you can use to bluff the river. In such cases, you might need to exercise caution to ensure that you're giving up often enough and not over-bluffing. However, there are some situations, particularly pertaining to early position, 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, things of this nature, where it's actually very difficult to find enough bluffs. Usually when the board comes down in such a way that absolutely smashes a range or just makes it difficult to have an unpaired hand, you have to turn pairs into bluffs. Whenever that's the case, it's very probable that an untrained population will be under-bluffing by failing to recalibrate their relative hand strength in relation to the wet runout. Let's take an example. Here we have a big blind versus under the gun single raise pot, flop of ace 10 deuce and under the gun bets range for 1/3 pot, a very sensible strategy. On the queen turn, under the gun barrels 75% of the pot. This is a decent choice because this is a turn card that does repolarize the big blind's range to some extent. After this b75, there are notably not that many absolute air combos left in the under the gun range. If under the gun then barrels the river, we're going to look at that range in a minute and what that should look like, but first, under the gun's range for arriving on this river is our starting point, and we're going to refer to under the gun's range for getting to this river as his landing range. A landing range is a range that has just arrived on an opportunity to do something. It's not yet split another time yet and hasn't elected to bet or check at this juncture. It's important to understand that the composition of a landing range plays a huge role in determining how often someone is likely to be bluffing. Of course, solvers and game theory are experts at this sort of thing and will be able to recalibrate their range, ensuring that they're always bluffing enough to cover all of the value hands in their range. However, humans often fall down at this point in the game tree. You'll note that this runout really doesn't leave a lot of air in the under the gun range, so let me ask you, can you list some bluffable hands that under the gun is supposed to arrive here with? We'll leave it off the table just now, the question of whether under the gun is actually bluffing or not, but what are some hands that have little enough showdown value that you would consider them bluff candidates in this spot? Pause the video and list some holdings. Assuming you've done that, you may have found that exercise quite tricky at first until you thought a bit more deeply about the situation. For example, normal combos like Queen Jack, King 10, Jack 10, which would be air on certain runouts, are just pairs now, and so it's not clear that they should be bluffed. If you didn't arrive on the river with low pocket pairs, you won't be able to bluff those, and if you do, you still need to recognize them as bluffing candidates. Let's take a look at the overall situation according to the solver. Another way to see a landing range is as the range with which a player took his most recent action on the previous street. So when under the gun bets the turn here with this range, this red band here will be the b75 range of course, and that will be the landing range on the river. You'll note that the solver recognizes the need to apply a lot of aggression with King X combos, understanding that in early position its value range is very abundant and there aren't many natural combos of air. It's basically not a thing to check back King X here on this node, and even some combos like Jack 10 and King 10 are turning themselves into bluffs despite having showdown value. Another region that you see bluffing here that may be counterintuitive to beginners or even intermediate poker players is the underpair region. A pair typically sets the imprint in our brain of a hand that just doesn't really have the need or want to bet on a higher board. This is because in the more common late position battles on slightly less wet or high textures, a pocket pair tends to just check back on the turn instead of barreling. Our brains are very good at quickly identifying patterns and firing down neural pathways that they've fired down many times before. If it's entrenched in your mind to check back a hand like sevens on the turn, you may well, especially if you're not focusing, miss the opportunity to bluff here given that this hand has been severely demoted by this very wet and difficult to miss runout. When a runout is difficult to miss, we really do start dipping into pocket pairs and even higher pairs on the board in order to reach a high enough bluffing frequency to render us unexploitable. That means that when we arrive on the river of the 9 of clubs, which is largely a brick, most of our hands are going to arrive here with some showdown value and will either be value betting or checking. But if you pay particular attention here to the bright red hands, these are the hands that have an EV of roughly 0. I don't think it's important whether they're slightly winning or slightly losing as a bet. The main important factor here will just be that they don't have showdown value and are therefore optional bluffs in this sort of neutral world. When you look at those hands, there aren't that many of them, and it would have been very easy to land here with even less still. If, for example, when you had a hand like King 8, you said to yourself, I'm going to mix this hand. I'll bet it sometimes. I rolled a high number or a low number, whatever indicates passivity in your RNG scheme, and therefore I'm going to check. Maybe you even thought something like, oh, this card is good for his range. It hits Queen Jack, Ace Queen, King Queen, Queen 10, Pocket Jacks. It improves all of these hands. I'm not going to bluff. There's lots of ways you can trick yourself into landing on this river with too weak of a range to want to bluff again. This is a very underbluffed spot compared with an equilibrium, and the reason that humans underbluff is not that they're unwilling to pull the trigger on the final bluff, it's because they didn't land there with the right composition of range to do so in the first place. In other words, they've been too passive on the turn with hands that maybe have the appearance of showdown value but aren't really, or possibly they've been too passive with hands that should just be betting all the time as a bluff. The hands in red are what we call bluffing candidates. They are weak enough to bluff, indicating that they are between tier 5 and tier 7, meaning devoid of showdown value. But they don't always bluff because this is a neutral spot for range and not a favourable one. If you've bluffed the turn with the right range composition, what will happen is that you'll arrive on this river with enough air combos that your EV is pretty low. This means if you continue to barrel off on a brick, you will soon be over bluffing and allowing your opponent a profitable exploit and never folding their own bluff catchers. To avoid this, you do have to mix bet only sparingly and generally favour the hands that are blocking King Jack. In reality, people tend to raise King Jack a bit too much on the turn instead of slow playing against a more polar range, thus the blocker is less important as an effect. If you look at the strategy here, you actually see 8s through 5s give up river, while the King High follow through, but if you look at the EV swings of giving up or betting each of these hands respectively, it's not actually a big deal. What it will come down to more in reality is whether your own opponent is overfolding or underfolding the spot. But the point is that you only have these optional river bluffs on the river if you've landed here with enough of them in the first place. Landing ranges are a really important concept. They're much more influential to where people are bluffing too much or too little compared with something like willingness to bluff. That said, there are 2 necessary ingredients for bluffing in every spot. Take an analogy. Imagine you're watching an action movie where everyone's shooting everyone. For one character to shoot another, the following things must be true. Character X must have a functional loaded gun, this is a given, and must be willing to shoot. You could maybe come up with a 3rd or 4th condition here, but these are definitely the central ones that we're going to focus on. If one of these necessary conditions is false, it will be impossible for X to shoot Y. Similarly in poker, in order for X to bluff against Y, the following things must be true. X must have arrived on the street in question, that's to say their landing range must contain a bluff candidate. If they're not holding a bluff candidate, they can't bluff. If they're holding a bluff candidate too rarely, they'll be bluffing too rarely. And B, X must be willing to bluff. For certain opponents, even if they did find the bets on the turn there with pocket 7s, pocket 6s, etc., they may well be unwilling to fire the last barrel on the river. Reluctance to bluff is a very common mental game leak, and the idea is that it just feels bad to put in the rest of your chips to invest that many big blinds without a strong hand. That's why a lot of these situations are underbluffed, especially against an early position opponent who just has a tighter range with less natural air. Speculating about your pool's willingness to shoot is a difficult thing to do. You don't really know for any reg unless you have a very big sample or you're very familiar with their tendencies as a player. Possibly you know them from live poker, real life, you just know how they play. Those things aside, those sort of luxuriously detailed reads aside, you're not going to have a strong idea about how willing they are to pull the trigger on the final river bet. Sometimes you hear people simplify to saying things like, they don't bluff, or they're spewy here, or something like that, but these are just made up, and they're generally based on recent variants, whether they've been successful, what hands the hero has seen upon calling down, that sort of thing. Because it is so difficult to speculate about how willing people are to bluff in different situations, it's much better to work off of A and actually look at how many bluffs the player is likely to arrive with. We can make very informed judgments about how a pool arrives on a node without having to worry about whether they would like to bluff or not if they did get there with a bad hand. The reason for this is that it's actually quite uniform and predictable how someone will go wrong from equilibrium when you present them with multiple hurdles to climb through. For example, if you force them to 3-bet the right range preflop, then c-bet the flop with everything and then barrel lots of underpairs and every king high on the turn, you can be quite confident that the average human is under bluffing. However, you can't really say when a human arrives on the river with pocket sevens, they're always going to give up. I do think that spot's likely going to be at the lower and micro stakes under-selected as a bluff, but the landing range is the bigger consideration. So in the spot we looked at, under the gun is likely to be under bluffing if his landing range contains fewer combinations than normal of low EV hands. Under the gun is likely to be over bluffing by contrast if his landing range contains more combinations than normal of low EV hands. Understanding what a player's landing range is supposed to be is the key to estimating if there's an exploit available with respect to our bluff catch strategy. Very often in poker, the key thing that you need to do is know what should be the case in theory. By having that benchmark, you can then spot where your opponents are unintentionally or intentionally deviating from such a strategy and find the right counter adaptations. If you don't know what's supposed to happen, for example in the hand that we looked at, if you don't know that hands like 8s, 7s, 6s and 5s and every king x suited is supposed to arrive on the river at a high frequency, you're not going to understand why your opponents are under bluffing that spot. If you yourself don't know how to play those hands on the turn, you're going to be under bluffing that spot. It's very difficult to say, I don't think they'll fancy it on the river here, I don't think they'll choose to bluff with king high if they get here with that hand, because we just don't know from person to person what's going to be true. It's quite intuitive to bluff with king high on the river here, but it's also not everyone's cup of tea. So it's unclear how often they're going to do that relative to how often GTO will. But what is clear is that they probably don't get here with this many bluff candidates, and that is what swings it to being a very underbluffed spot. I'll let you guys into a little secret. I've been running an exploitative course for a few months now. I've done a couple of intakes of that course, and what students are generally quite shocked by is just how big an impact the position of the preflop opener or 3-better or 4-better actually has on how under or over bluff the spot is by the river. We spend a lot of time studying river data because that's where we look at showdown, but we see that when somebody started off under the gun, they're generally massively under bluffing compared to when they started off on the button. If you want a very quick freebie on exploitative play for now, tend to overfold your range on most textures against under the gun's multiple aggression, but tend to overcall against that of button or small blind. Cutoff is a bit more neutral and hijack is slightly underbluffed. It all makes sense when you trace things back to the origin of the range because there just weren't as many natural candidates landing on every street with which the player can bluff. That means that the unclued up human will have to bluff at a much higher frequency than is natural in later position, and because earlier position spots are actually rarer, it'll be counterintuitive. The brain will formulate its rules about bluff frequency, oftentimes based on the most common situations it's in, and not be fluid enough at modifying this from spot to spot. Let's meet two river bluff catching fallacies here to see how people go wrong when they face river bets. These are not to say that people are always choosing the wrong action, but their thought process leading up to the decision of whether to call a river bet or not is often very illogical and flawed, and here's how. Firstly, the willingness fallacy. The belief that whether we should call a river bet depends on how aggressively minded humans are if they are holding air. But what if this guy just rarely has a gun? Would you be scared about this guy shooting you if he probably didn't have a gun? Much less so. So just caring about whether somebody wants to bluff you when they're holding air is only a piece of the puzzle. The rest of it and the much bigger part comes from the original range composition and how often the gun will exist in the first place. The gun here being the bluffing candidate. The correction to this pitfall is to see bluff frequency as a combination of willingness and landing range, and I think the latter factor is the more significant one. The key question you should ask yourself for this is how easy is it for a human to have bluff candidates in the first place in their landing range for a given node? If they've just landed on the flop with all of their button range, it'll be incredibly easy to c-bet with air and just have air a lot of the time, and if you check all the way to the river and someone still has most of their air, it's completely normal for them to overbluff as a human on that node. However, if someone has taken multiple filtering actions on a hard to miss board from an early position, you can bet your money on the fact that this is an underbluffed node and you should overfold your range. Secondly, we have the expect to lose fallacy. Very often humans are wired in a way that's supposed to preserve their chances of survival, but what it actually does in poker is ruins their chances of winning. It's quite paradoxical. The expect to lose fallacy is the belief that when we're going to lose most of the time, it means that villain is under bluffing. For example, let's say I face a half pot size bet on the river. If you know your poker math, you'll be aware that I only need 25% equity to call and break even in an end of action spot against the sizing. This might be different in an out of position situation on an earlier street, for example, because there would be lots of other things going on and it would be much harder to realize equity. There may be implied odds, there may be future fold equity. I wouldn't be able to do this math. But in position or even out of position facing the final bet of the hand on the river, I can easily just start engaging with how much I need based on the pot odds and whether I think I'll meet that target. The problem is that the subconscious is not used to working in terms of needing 25% of something in order to select that thing. If something was 75% bad and 25% good in real life, almost all of us would reject that if we were thinking rationally. Oftentimes, in order to accept risk in real life, many of us need things to be a good bit better than just 50-50. For example, if I asked you whether you wanted to bet 10 grand right now, on the roll of a dice, you take numbers 1 through 3, I take 4 through 6. Would you take the bet? If you're thinking yes, you're probably a bit of a degenerate, but that's okay. We all are in poker. But for most people, and even most poker players, we'd say no to that bet. So the expect to lose fallacy is all about the subconscious, the demon, the well-trodden neural network in your brain firing up in a spot where actually you need a new, unique neural network that understands the true target. The old ingrained thought process basically tells your subconscious that something has to be more good than bad in order for you to make an investment. This is very false when I face that half pot river bet and just need 1/4 of the pot to break even. If I'm winning 1/3 of the time and I elect to fold, I make a very large blunder in terms of EV, percentage pot. Another reason why the expect to lose fallacy bites really hard is because losing is considered painful. Painful things that hurt or cause distress are ingrained, and the brain makes a special effort to emphasize these things above all other experience. If tomorrow you spend your day in a fairly normal way just doing things that are part of your daily routine, but you cut yourself very badly on a certain object in your house, you're going to have a certain avoidance or caution around that object for the next few weeks. That said, in 3 weeks' time, you won't remember anything else that happened tomorrow. Or possibly you remember some things, but it won't be in as such a vivid and strong emotive way. A lot of poker players hate the feeling of paying people off. They hate the idea that if you have a better hand than me and I call you, that I've not done anything wrong. It's okay to pay people off. It's okay to lose 70% of the time when you call a half pot size bet on the river. In fact, that's great. But the expect to lose fallacy basically comes up because the student expects to lose because the vividness and the pain of losing are more ingrained in the times that they've won. Moreover, the subconscious is trying to win an unreasonably large amount of the time because it's accidentally and inadvertently applying real life standards to poker. The correction here is to remember that your required equity is identical to what villain's bluff to value ratio should be. So for example, when I come across that opponent that just randomly half pots the river and I picture some hand that beats me and want to fold to avoid the discomfort of calling, what I need to do instead is remember that when someone half pots the river, they're only meant to be bluffing 25% of the time. If accidentally they actually just have 2-to-1 value bets to bluffs instead of 3-to-1, then they're over bluffing and they're actually rendering it very profitable for me to call every single bluff catcher in my range. The equity swing of calling a bluff catcher with a good blocker as opposed to one with a bad blocker is rarely more than about 3 or 4% of the pot. This means that as soon as somebody is accidentally over bluffing or under bluffing, the swing is much more relevant. When you're bluff catching, you should usually try as hard as you can to engage with your opponent's landing range, to look at what they show up within that spot on average compared to what they're supposed to, and make an educated guess about whether the average opponent in your games is under bluffing or over bluffing. This is a much more fruitful thought process than engaging with exact blockers and trying to call really accurately like a GTO robot. That said, trying to be a GTO robot isn't a bad starting point when you have no other exploit, but you need to keep your mind open and understand that people don't just play the way a solver plays. Another key question you can ask yourself with the expect to lose fallacy is, what win target is my subconscious trying to set for me here, and how close is it to my true required win percentage? If you catch yourself in the act of wanting to win the majority of the time in order to feel happy about calling a river bet, you've caught your subconscious wreaking havoc on your game. You can interrupt it and set yourself on the right course for finding a logical thought process. Let's look at how the bluff catching system tends to change when the bet we're facing is of a block sizing of B33. In this spot, small blind checks the flop instead of c-betting, something they'll be able to do around 60 to 65% of the time here, and then goes for a block bet on the turn. We've already seen in the Carrot Poker School Grade 2 Lecture 2 that this is a nice sizing for such a spot where small blind's range typically contains a lot of thin value bets which don't do amazingly by checking out of position. Building the B33 is a nice alternative to always checking a hand with around 60 to 65% equity, and so this exists at some frequency. Big blind, however, is the one in the really tough situation here, because they're facing a sizing that actually forces them to defend a whopping 75% of their range in this relatively neutral world. Why is this world neutral? Because although small blind has a slight equity advantage, the positional disadvantage equalizes things and allows big blind to survive here. Big blind's pot entitlement in EV will be about 50% of the pot, and that means meeting the MDF and folding only pot odds norm. This means defending roughly 3/4 of your range. How do you think this spot fits into the bluff catcher system from the last lecture? It's the same thing, but what we're going to do now is defend more often. So instead of calling half of our bluff catchers as we sought to do against the B75, this time we're going to be looking at calling almost all of them. This means that even some of the best grade C bluff catchers are going to become pure calls, many grade C bluff catchers will be mixes, and only the worst grade C bluff catchers will be considered folds. When it comes to frail hands, we'll even have to make some speculative calls here with overcards in order to meet the right defense frequency, and understanding that our pot entitlement doesn't need to be very high, especially with the advantage of position, to call such a small bet. With our value beaters, we'll often want to raise. Yes, we've capped our range on the flop by checking behind, but no, that doesn't mean we can't still have a 9 or a 4. We're going to build some 9x and 4x into our raising range here because our small blind opponent is not very filtered as of yet and has done a considerable amount of things to cap their own range. While small blind could still have a nutted hand here, it's quite unlikely after the combination of checking and then betting 1/3 pot instead of bigger on the turn. That's assuming small blind had a bigger toolkit than this, had a bigger sizing than this in their toolkit, and most people would. So because the pot odds are so good and the spot is not unfavourable for range, remember we could be overfolding a spot that's unfavourable for range even in position, but this board isn't, and so we will be continuing actually a bit more than 75%, a bit more than MDF. This happens when we're in position in a fairly decent extra for our range where the configuration pre-flop is not adverse to us. So being big blind isn't great pre-flop against small blind because we lack a lot of these nutted hands, but by this point in the game tree, small blind doesn't have those nutted hands very often and ranges are very equal. This is going to involve calling everything but hopelessly frail hands and the very worst bluff catchers. If you think about our own range as being quite capped here, because we've checked behind on the flop, remembering that the in-position player has higher urgency to bet, you'll then understand that we have to defend hands that look really bad. How would you feel about having a hand like King Jack here, for example, with no draw? You should feel really positive and should actually be mixing this hand between a sort of hybrid / bluff raise and a call. You should not be folding a hand like King Jack or King 10 on this node because these hands actually have showdown value and very good pair draws. Similarly, most of your ace-x combos are going to just be calling in this situation because they're very high in showdown value. Folding a pair would clearly be absurd, and when we break down the bluff catcher system, we can actually see that there's many grade B bluff catchers here that don't look very good, but they're actually just mixing. A hand like King Queen is probably a grade B bluff catcher. It's nothing special, but it does have really good pair draw, and this hand cannot fold when given such a good price. Grade B bluff catchers are just entitled to more of the pot than they need to be to stick around in this spot. Another thing that you need to be quite conscious of here is how to find bluff raises on this node. You're going to get here with a bunch of flush draws, and these make reasonable bluff raise candidates. That said, you don't need to have a flush draw to raise, and as you can see, the solver chooses to raise with some Queen Jack offsuit, Queen 10 offsuit, Ace 8 offsuit. All kinds of hands are actually hybrids or possibly just pure bluff raises. Finding these hands is counterintuitive. You've just shown passivity. Why would you now be aggressive? The idea is that your range is uncapped quite considerably by this 4. A 4 is a sort of combo that you'll check back on the flop fairly frequently, although not always, and so you'll have quite a wide value range on this node. You can also raise some of the best and most vulnerable 9x, such as Ace 9 and 9 8 respectively. So next time you play this spot, I'd like you to try a bit harder to actually adjust to the relative hand strength that your holding has based on the wide configuration and the lack of post-flop filtering that's taken place here. If we make our way through the bluff catcher system, we can see that frail hands like Jack 10 are mixing fold, call, and raise. Even Jack 10 off here is choosing to bluff sometimes. We can see that there's some frail hands that are actually calling here. Calling this bet with a hand, for example, such as Queen 10, that's probably not a hand that beats every bluff in your opponent's range, though it will be close to that, but the hand has enough redraw and future bluffing potential that it can call. Remember, when you're in position facing a turn bet, it's a bit like being out of position on the flop, but better, because you're always going to realize the rest of your equity, and then you'll have the chance to bluff the river if villain checks in a very favorable world where you have a lot of fold equity. Moving up the bluff catcher system, our grade C bluff catchers are going to be things like Queen Jack suited, things of this nature, maybe some kind of King X with 2 big cards, that sort of thing. These hands are very dicey, but because we're facing such a small bet, they're actually 0 EV investments. Grade B bluff catchers such as decent Ace-X and good King-X are normal calls, and our value beaters such as very good Ace-X that's actually chopping with villain's Ace-X or even beating it, and of course pocket pairs are going to be calling or raising. Hopefully that's useful, and it kind of shocks you into seeing that in these very wide range configurations, when there's been minimal investment and you're in position, you've got to defend a lot more than you would think. Another secret here, exploitatively, small blinds B33 on this turn is very successful in reality. The reason this bet works incredibly well, especially as a bluff or sort of vulnerable hybrid protection bet, is that the big blind just doesn't protect their flop checking range enough, doesn't apply enough pressure by raising turn, and overfolds their range against its sizing. In reality, you can see a big blind player fold 40 to 50% of the time here instead of 24% in a fairly straightforward and low stakes game. This is huge. The biggest swings in poker come from exploits, but we need to understand theory in order to see where those are. If your motivation for taking this course was to not play exploitatively anymore and just play theoretically soundly, I don't recommend that. I recommend building exploitative layers into your game once you see what theory is recommending and how people will fail to do it. Let's move on. When we're bluff catching against large bets like an overbet, in this spot, small blind can equally overbet here just as they can go for the small bet. They will have overpairs and 4x in their own range in this spot, as well as some very good 9x that's maybe good enough for this task. But when we're facing a B150 as big blind, it's another really gross spot, and big blind is super capped here with the exception of a 4, but big blind has to defend way tighter. This is still quite difficult to do when you don't have such an uncapped range though. The pot odds dictate here that in a neutral world, the big blind will only have to defend 40% of the time, and remember this is roughly a neutral world. We don't assume that this world suddenly becomes unfavourable after small blind overbets, because that would be to assume that small blind is underbluffing for the overbet. Small blind started off in a neutral world when this turn came down, and so it's still supposed to be neutral after they bet. They're not meant to bet an overly strong nor an overly weak range. So now the bluff catcher system is going to look quite different. As you can see, our frail hands are now almost exclusively folding, only continuing when they're a draw that's as good enough as 5-6 or spades mainly. When it comes to bluff catchers, now we're folding most of our grade B and our grade C, only choosing to really call with grade A because we're trying to make sure that we don't make any losing calls against what's a more polarized and selectively constructed range. Our value beaters are still calling, but we should note that we have much less of these now because it's not so frequent that we're going to run into a hand that we actually beat having checked back the flop. That said, it can happen. Villain can be overbetting here with an overpair, we can have a 4, or we can have a better 4 than them in a very lucky and rare occasion, but for the most part, our hands are mainly going to be bluff catchers or frail hands in at this spot. And of course, we know due to Clark's theorem that raise is now gone from our strategy and should be simplified away by any sane person. Raising counts as a large investment, theoretically speaking. We shall only make small investments because we're against a hyperpolarized range. Yes, villain checked the flop, but that didn't cap their range. The overbet has now firmly left their range uncapped and quite polarized, and therefore our range is going to be condensed by comparison. When you have a much more condensed range than your opponent, you don't want to be making big investments. Raising is a big investment, so we prefer to make the smaller investment of calling. Don't worry about losing value by picking this strategy of not raising. The solver's pretty close to this itself, and it thinks that for any hand that can raise for value, it can also call. The reason that this is the case is that, of course, our opponent's range is super polarized and will be continuing to bluff our value bet on the next node anyway, and given that we're in position, if villain checks, we'll have the chance to value bet on the river. Interestingly, the raise frequency in this spot is only 1.63%. When you see something like that and you see no hand pure raising, that's how you've got a fair idea that you can just simplify that out of your strategy. When it comes to folding, we can see that we're actually again underfolding slightly compared to the pot odds norm. The reason we're underfolding compared to pot odds norm here is that we're in a fairly decent spot for range, though not a good one, but we do have the positional advantage. It's very common to actually be underfolding in these situations, because when we're in position, what we'd actually like to do is make villains' weaker hands close to 0 EV if they choose to bluff. This will make them a worse idea than checking, and actually villain is supposed to be losing EV by bluffing the absolute worst tier 7 candidates out of position in spots that are not good for their range. When it comes to bluff catching against double barrels, I'd like to give you guys a little bit of hands-on practice. In this situation, we play the role of the big blind caller. We call a B33 from the button and then face a B75 on the turn. If you've been paying attention in class, you'll probably know that button should be overbetting here in order to be completely theoretically sound, but we are going to face B75 a lot in practice, so let's get our teeth into how to react. The following exercise is done under the premise that this is button's only turn sizing. The sim that I've run here did not give the villain the chance to overbet. That's important because if villain had the chance to both B75 and overbet here, what we'd see is that the B75 would only represent a tiny shred of combos, and moreover those combos would be very uniquely chosen. This would not actually be representative of what the population that you play against is doing when they B75 this turn. In essence, for almost any reg that B75s here, it's their only sizing. Since hero has already overfolded on the flop, we should note that we have shed the range disadvantage that we'd normally start with here. On the flop, we got rid of a lot of trash. We decided not to hang around with the bottom of our range and folded 34% of the time to the c-bet in a spot where pot odds norm is only 25. Now that we've got all of the overfolding out of our system, so to speak, and now that the spot has become neutral, we're going to try to defend the turn around the pot odds norm. This is going to mean that the fold equity against B75 that villain gets is no more and no less than about 41 to 44%. Again, it's not that important whether it's a couple of percent out. You will see some noise. You'll see solvers slightly over defend in position, slightly over fold out of position sometimes, but it's not a big deal. Thus, we're going to be shooting to defend around the right frequency of 57% here. What class of hands do you think the following ones are in the bluff catching system? And would you call, fold, or mix them versus the turn bet? Some of these hands you might also raise, but I want you to sort of leave that as an aside for now. Have a look at the following 9 hands, pause the video, and actually try to drag them into a spot in this bluff catching system. You might have to do that mentally or write out the buckets on some kind of Word document or notepad and drop the hands in there. Once you've completed the exercise, unpause the video and I'll show you what I think. Hand number 1. The Queen 8. So this is the second barrel we're facing, so clearly this hand is no longer going to be a value beater. A value beater, to reiterate the lesson 7 final slide, would be a hand that's beating or chopping with at least one of villain's value bets. Remember, when villain bets the turn, they'll be betting for a very clear reason, usually value betting or bluffing, and while there will be some hybrids, we're going to ignore these for the purposes of this exercise. Thus, if we don't beat any of the hands our opponent is clearly value betting, we're going to deem our hand a bluff catcher or frail hand. Assuming that we beat all of the bluffs, we're going to have a bluff catcher. Queen 8 definitely is a hand that beats every hand villain could be bluffing here, but does not beat a single value bet. How good of a bluff catcher is it? Saying something is a bluff catcher does not tell us whether we need to call, raise, or fold. What we're going to be doing here for the most part is calling this hand. Well, we will always be calling this hand. We'll be calling all grade A bluff catchers here, and this hand is certainly grade A. The reason this hand is really good mainly comes down to the equity it has against villains' bluffs. If you'll recall the final part of lecture 7, there were 3 criteria on the turn that allowed us to grade the bluff catcher we're currently holding. The first was, of course, the improvability against villains' value range, which is pretty good with Queen 8. Queen 8 has 5 outs against a hand like Ace King or Pocket Aces, and so it's very far from dead. Queen 8 is also quite robust against villain's bluffing range, which is the second factor on our checklist, because it's rare that villain will have an overcard to this pair. They might have a gutter or open ender, there's not much we can do about that, but at least we don't have a hand like Pocket Fours, spoiler alert, where villain has a ton of overcards to go with any straight draw, or just overcards when they're betting with the bottom of their range, something that the imposition player is of course allowed to do in favourable worlds like this one. So Queen 8 is going to slot in here. It's a grade A bluff catcher and a very comfortable call. If you fold this hand, you commit an EV mistake. Pocket 8s is not such a good bluff catcher. This is functioning as a hand that's much more vulnerable to villain's bluffing range, doesn't retain as much equity when it is ahead, and only has 2 outs to improve when it's behind. The good news is that those 2 outs are very nutted indeed, and drawing to a set is much better than drawing to trips or 2 pair because it avoids future domination worries more. Pocket 8s actually doesn't have the best blockers. I guess they're not the worst, but you are blocking a bunch of bluffs by having 2 8s here. Villain will sometimes be bluffing hands like Jack 8, 9 8, 10 8 on these nodes depending on suit. Therefore, with the 8s, we're actually indifferent between calling and folding. This hand is on the cusp of being a grade B to grade C bluff catcher. Mostly I'd say it's bad grade B, and so it's mixing call with fold. Ace 3 is again an improvement because it has 5 outs on the board. It's going to function as a clear grade B bluff catcher, and these are going to be defended mostly against the sizing. Ace 10, you can see that this hand is definitely on the borderline between being frail, and I think it's probably okay for villain to bluff some Ace 10 combos here. I suspect Ace Jack will check back here, but because Ace 10 will bluff, there is a bluff in villain's range that we do not actually beat, and therefore this hand has to be deemed frail. I think it would be okay to call this hand barely, but it would be okay also to raise or to fold. Usually you fold frail hands out of position, but this one is only barely frail, coming in with still a fair amount of showdown value. I think Ace Jack here is a very normal call. King 5 is a hand that's clearly moving into value beater territory now. Villain can value bet some bad top pair. This is just on the cusp between value beater and bluff catcher because it's only barely ahead of a value bet. This hand is beating certain value bets like Ace Queen or King 4 and chopping with King 5, and that alone is enough to make it highly profitable. If the average bluff catcher is a break-even investment, then any hand that also beats or chops some value will be a profitable one. Pocket 4s only has 2 outs to redraw, and basically all of villain's draws, regardless of what they are, pair draws, straight draws, will have 2 overcards. This hand is pretty terrible to call with, for the second reason that it will also be blocking some bluffs like 4-5, 4-6 and Ace 4. This hand is a fold and a grade C bluff catcher. It does beat every bluff, but just not in a convincing enough way. Ace 4 of diamonds is a hand that you can't really call with, that's coming in as frail. You can raise this hand and you do need to find some bluffs here, but I don't think this one can call profitably because villain may be bluffing a few better ace high. It might be close though, and this is another hand that's not a million miles away from being a bluff catcher. 5-3 is a bluff catcher. The 5 is going to be a bit worse than the ace, rendering the hand a bit more vulnerable to villain's ace high bluffs. This hand is a mix between call or fold, and it's the same category of hand as pocket 8s. While 5-3 has more improvability than 8s, it's performing worse against bluffs, and probably has slightly worse blocker in the 5 than the 8. I think the 5 is blocking more bluffs than the 8 is. The 3 is a really nice blocker to have, blocking value bets and always unblocking bluffs, but only one of our cards is a 3. Jack 10 is a frail hand. This one I don't really believe you can call. I think raise is better, but you'd be surprised how close this will actually be to a call. EV of calling this hand is better than you might think due to the combination of implied odds, equity, and some times when we actually win the pot with Jack high when villain just gives up some lower bluff like 10-9 or Jack 9. Hope you found that one useful. Feel free to pause here and go back through this exercise. It's definitely a very viable use of your time and something that I'd want to revise in detail. We now move on to looking at bluff catching against river triple barrels. We'll do another quiz here just to hone our skills in applying the bluff catching system. Big blind goes ahead and check calls a range bet from button, a very reasonable strategy. Button then goes ahead and B75s the turn. I think this is again not quite the accurate sizing, but we'll assume that this is button's only sizing, as this will be the case with most humans you play against. And then we check and face a third bet on the river, which is also B75. Bluff catching system here is going to be similar to the last time in terms of percentage of range that we're calling, because this is again a neutral world after button bets the river. The reason this world becomes neutral after button bets river is that they are not incentivized to overbluff this spot in GTO. Because the 7 of hearts is not a particularly useful card for button's range because their wooden spoons are not being promoted into guns and our knives are pretty steadfast on the 7 of hearts river, button is actually going to land on the river in an unfavorable node in EV. However, when they bet, they will shed most of their air into the checkback range, only retaining a bit of it with which to balance their river betting range. The world thus becomes neutral. So just as many opponents simplify the betting 75% on the turn, the same is often done on the river. If you look at a pre-built GTO program in this sort of situation and try to look up the river strategy, one of the problems is that there may be 4 or 5 bet sizes being utilized with range. In this spot, that would be highly confusing and counterintuitive, so I'd recommend having a custom solver if you want to study these situations and plugging in one sizing where you think that's what your opponent is doing. If you're playing in a live 1-2 game, for example, or 5NL online game, you're not going to see people with multiple river sizes in their strategy on these notes. The B75 will just be the go-to sizing for most people. Now Hero's Calling hand selection is going to shift to being more blocker focused. There is no showdown value difference here, and there's no such thing as having good equity against bluffs or bad equity against bluffs for a bluff catcher. Things become a lot more binary on the river because our bluff catchers are going to be winning against all of villains' bluffs and losing against all of their value hands. Thus, there is no further grading between bluff catchers in terms of the equity that they have against these regions respectively. Rather, the thing that's going to matter is going to be blocker properties only. Here we see the bluff catcher system again. Let's move on to the exercise now, only this time I'd like to talk about each hand individually. That means pausing the video before we look at the answers each time. Let's start with the Queen 8 of clubs, have a think about this, and then unpause. So Queen 8 of clubs is still a bluff catcher. Quite clearly it's winning against all of villains' bluffs. That doesn't change. What's going to matter now is the properties of the bluff catcher. We can no longer be really happy about this hand's robustness against villains' bluffs because all bluff catchers are 100% equity now against villains' bluffing range. Nor can we think about improvability because there are no streets to come after the river. The only thing that matters now is removal effect. The queen is a very good card for that. Of course, villain is never bluffing with a queen in his hand, so we're not going to be removing any bluffs. However, villain is going to be value betting combos like pocket queens and king queen, and so this is a positive blocker. The 8 is a slightly negative blocker, though I don't think 8x is a massive part of villain's bluffing range on the river. If you think about the hands that villain ends up bluffing here, mostly in GTO, they're going to contain a 9, 10, jack or ace a bit more frequently than they are going to contain an 8. Not only are these cards selected pre-flop in their offsuit abundant forms more frequently, but they're also chosen as bluffs more often on the turn due to their nut potential. Queen 8 therefore is a pretty good bluff catcher with one slightly negative blocker and a very positive one. We're going to be calling this hand again. As we can see, Queen 8 comes in here on our spectrum as a grade A/B bluff catcher, which is more than enough strength to call this sort of bet. The next hand I'd like you to consider is pocket 8s. Assuming that you've done that, I'll go over what I think of this hand now. This hand doesn't have as much of a positive removal effect as Queen 8. It's failing to remove, in fact, a single combo from villain's value range here. I think King 8 is probably checking back on this node, and I don't think that villain has any other 8x value bets in their range. Meanwhile, the pocket 8s are blocking some bluffs, so this is going to be a fairly miserable looking bluff catcher and one that we're just folding. Grade C, pure fold, no need to call grade C against B75, just grade B and better. The next hand is Ace 3. How do you think this one is changing? The 3 is going to block some value hands. It's going to remove King 3, Queen 3 suited if it exists, some people open that, some don't, and then pocket 3s from the deck, so pretty useful. Ace I don't think is going to block a ton of bluffs. Villain's main bluffs will contain, as I say, a jack, a 10 or a 9, a bit more than an ace, but there will be maybe some ace-x hands betting the river. Overall, Ace 3 is a good enough bluff catcher to call. Its EV is slightly worse than Queen 8 just because it's blocking less value combos. Remember, blocking King Queen off is important. You don't really block King 3 or Queen 3 off because they're not opened pre. But this hand is still a comfortable call. The fourth hand on our list is Ace 10. What do you think about this one? Well, quite clearly this is really flirting with the idea of being a frail hand, and you can't call a frail hand on the river because the only reason you really call frail hands pre-river is that they have redraw and implied odds. None of these things can exist on the final street of betting. Next up is King 5. Where does this one come in? I'll assume you've unpaused. The answer with King 5 is that it's actually been degraded down to a bluff catcher now. Of course it's still a call, and a king is going to be better than any other card in the deck at blocking value bets, and therefore we're not going to be folding a grade A bluff catcher like this one, but because villain is no longer value betting just naked King X bad kicker, we can no longer describe this hand as a value beater. It's about the best bluff catcher we can have, and folding would be really crazy and basically equate to folding all of our range, but the EV of King 5 has now been reduced far more towards 0 than it was on a previous street. It's important to understand that it's not just that this hand is top pair, that it's a call, it's because the blocker of top pair is so powerful. There's actually no difference in showdown value here between King 5 and Queen 8. In other words, King 5 loses to all the hands in villain's range that are value betting that Queen 8 does, and beats every bluff just as the same as Queen 8 does. The problem for Queen 8 is it doesn't have as good a value bet blocking card in it as King 5 does. The King is just a better blocker than the Queen. 6 is the Queen Jack suited. What do you think about this one? Try to compare this hand to the Queen 8 and think carefully. Assuming you've got an answer, the main idea here is that the only thing we've changed is the side card. We're blocking just the same number of value combos as we are with Queen 8, but now we're blocking more bluffs as well. Therefore, the caliber of this bluff catcher has been degraded to C/B, and the hand is now merely a break-even call. Ace-4 is the next one. Of course, this hand is frail, it's not doing anything, and it's nowhere near calling. Just as an important point, you'll see that the raises here have actually indicated as being hands that are frail. This isn't quite right. In fact, a lot of our bluff catchers are going to be raising on this node as well. There may be some frail hands with good blockers to raise here, but for the most part, our raises on the river come from our bluff catcher region. The reason that that happens is that we want to interfere with villain's value range whenever we're raising. Of course, we're not really talking about that today, but it's worth pointing out. We'll look at this more in lecture 10. How is the 5-3 faring now? What do you think? Well, we have a 3, but this time with a 5 instead of an ace. What that's going to mean is that the blocker is much worse, and this hand is now classed as grade C and a pure fold. I don't think the EV swing of calling this hand will be a disaster, and in reality I would very well call this hand against a recreational player, because it turns out that most recreational players are over-bluffing when they're on the button but not earlier on in the game tree. I would definitely be happy peeling this hand with the slightest bit of an exploitative read that my opponent was over-bluffing. I couldn't say the same thing about ace-4 of diamonds. But not all folds are created equally, some are closer to calls than others. Jack-10 is of course an absurd call, and it would make an equally insane bluff raise. You want to be removing villains' value bets more when you raise here and not their bluffs. Not only does this hand not beat bluffs, it also blocks them. It's about the worst hand I could imagine investing with on this node. We can get here with a little bit of Jack-10, because like I said on the turn, the hand is not so bad to call with, not as bad as it looks. Let's move on. Hopefully you found those exercises useful. On to one of my favourite analogies when I'm trying to teach someone how to think about whether to play exploitatively or theoretically. The castles analogy is a way of understanding whether you should be exploiting villain or not, or whether exploits are available. Let's say that you and I both own unrelated castles. The construction of these castles is independent and neither one of us knows about the other's castle. What are the chances that both of our castles contain exactly the same number of bricks? What do you think? Write down an answer, have one in your head. Well, practically zero. But which of these castles contains more bricks? What do you think? I know these aren't real castles, and you need to take this exercise with a pinch of salt, but I'd like you to vote A or B. It's difficult, it's not clear. If you had a strong feeling that one of these castles would contain more bricks than the other, I suspect you're making things up. It just doesn't seem derivable from this picture which one of these has more. If you made me pick, maybe I would choose B, but maybe not actually. It's really unclear, but what we do know is that they don't have the same number. Very often we can know that two things are different to one another without actually knowing how. Just like your house and my house are different, but I don't know what your house looks like, and vice versa. The point is that things can be different, but if we don't know how, we can't really use the information that things are different. We know that A and B don't have the same number of bricks, but there's nothing we can do about it because we don't know which one has more. What about now though? There is no optical illusion going on here, no tricks of the camera. Let's assume that Castle A has more bricks than Castle B. Now we can say that the castles have a different number of bricks and we know in which direction. In case A, one of the castles certainly contains more bricks, but we don't know which. It's unclear. That's like saying in poker there is an exploit available. Villain strategy and the GTO strategy don't contain the same frequencies with the same combos, but we don't know what the exploit is, because we don't know exactly how villain strategy differs from that of equilibrium, or we don't even know roughly. You don't need to know exactly, of course, that's overkill. In this case, it's like saying that we do have an exploit. That's to say villain is playing a different strategy to equilibrium, and we know roughly how it's different and what to do about it. It's very frequent in poker that we're actually looking at the second case here, where one line is clearly better than another, even though game theory says they should be the same. However, in many other common spots where people play roughly sensibly, and your opponent is a regular who's got some skills, it's not going to be easy to just ascertain which line is better. These are the situations and the only situations in which we mix, when it's unclear which castle has more bricks. If there's an exploit and we know what it is, we should take it. Usually in poker, the amount of counter-exploitation that can happen to you by seizing an exploit is minimal to none. The reason for this is that if your opponent is already playing in a really unbalanced way, it's unlikely that they're aware of it or that they're doing it to set a trap that they can then re-exploit you. Moreover, they're not going to necessarily notice when they're being exploited or when people change their strategies to take advantage of their mistakes. So usually, when you see someone doing something wrong and you know how to punish it, you should go all out with that punish. That's to say, if I think you're overbluffing the river, I should call all of my bluff catchers and not worry about counter-exploitation. Most people who are overbluffing the river massively are going to continue to do that, and you don't play enough hands with someone in a normal context like playing 50 NL Zoom or playing at a live 1-2 table for that to become a problem. Let's talk about spotting imbalances. How do we get better at this particular skill? One of the following 3 nodes that I'm going to show you is underbluffed, meaning the opponent is using a lower bluff to value ratio than Equilibrium would recommend, and therefore calling is likely bad with a bluff catcher against that strategy, regardless of the grade of bluff catcher actually. One of the following is unclear. We can't really tell which line is higher EV, call or fold. We don't know if the opponent is overbluffing or underbluffing, and the other is overbluffed. I'd like you to think about the landing range of your opponents. Think back to the start of this class. How did they get to the node you're about to see before you pause the video and solve this? Here are the 3 nodes. I'd like you to assign a label of underbluffed, overbluffed, or unclear to these 3 hands. Case A is facing a triple barrel that's a B150, button versus big blind, in this spot. So we've called flop, we've called turn, and we face a triple on this card. Case B is big blind against hijack, and we've checked back the flop as the hijack and faced a half pot lead or pro bet from the big blind. Case C is a double delayed C bet, where as the big blind we've checked twice, hijack has checked twice too, and upon checking the river for the 3rd time, the big blind faces a B75 from hijack. I'd like to assign your labels now: underbluffed, unclear, overbluffed to these 3 spots. I'll now assume that you've unpaused the video having done that, and I'll give you the answers. This one is almost certainly going to be underbluffed. It's not based on positions. The button does tend to bluff quite a lot overall, but texturally speaking, this is a very difficult board to not underbluff. The reason is that it's just hard to have a random Jack X offsuit here that isn't a pair. It's also hard to have Ace X and just fire 3 times. Most bluffs do come from a Jack X or Ace X region here, but it's going to be difficult for your opponents to show up with enough of them. Another off-putting thing for the in-position player on this node is that the Queen River is a disaster zone card for them, which hits the big blind really hard and makes it very unappetizing to bluff, to say the least. This is an underbluff node based on both landing range and willingness to bluff on such a runout. You can actually look at both factors here. Case B is likely overbluffed. Someone who bets half pot on this turn is most probably going to be a weaker player. This is because the optimal sizing for such a spot is going to be very large with a sparing frequency. In this situation, the out of position player has a nut advantage but no range advantage and is going to want to bet infrequently and large, like I say. When you see someone B50 here, it's way too likely they're being unselective, and as we know in Equilibrium, it would be a big mistake to lead a hand like 7-9 of hearts in this spot. However, you'll see weaker players do this all the time. It's almost impossible that Case B isn't underbluffed against an average recreational player. Case C is much more unclear. I think that these spots are usually overbluffed when people wait until the river, but against hijack it's an early position on the table with a tighter range, and you also have a runout that's not the easiest one in the world to miss. I'd imagine this spot plays roughly balanced and that there isn't a big swing in either direction here by overcalling or undercalling your range. It's a bit like saying yes, probably villain is either overbluffing or underbluffing here, but it's close enough that we can't tell which, and so we don't really mind just playing in a normal, theoretically solid way. Homework task 8 is going to be the following. Question 1 is going to be big blind against hijack facing a double barrel, and question 2 is going to be facing a triple barrel on that wetter 2-tone texture. For each spot, I'd like you to think about, firstly, how does your fold percentage differ from the pot odds norm, and why? Will you be overfolding, underfolding, or will it be roughly the same? B, what will be the bluff catching system? What will be its layout? And where are the calling thresholds with robust and frail hands? And finally C, I'd like you to pick 6 hands and say where each of them fits in the bluff catching system and why. These should be a mix of frail hands, bluff catchers, and value beaters, and I'd like at least 3 of those to be bluff catchers of different tiers preferably. I'll let you have an attempt at the homework now, and when you're ready, come back to this point in the video and press play, and we'll go over the answers. Let's go over the answers. So here we have the reaction to the B75 on the turn. The first question we have to answer here is how does our fold percentage differ from the pot odds norm in this situation? What we can actually see here is that the fold percentage is a little bit lower. It's actually 38% instead of 42%. While these differences aren't generally that massive, you will see that on a card like a 4 that's just so connected and offering so much equity to the out of position player's range that they're going to be folding a little bit less than average. This is why the in-position player is not in a very favourable world to start with and will have to be selective to some extent about what they bluff. Next up, we need to decide what the bluff catching system is going to look like, where are the calling thresholds with respect to robust and frail hands. What we can see here, firstly, looking at frail hands, we might look at a hand like Jack 10 of hearts and not really understand why we'd want to call such a hand. But of course, it's not just a case of equity. While we're not getting possibly 30% equity with this hand, we are going to have implied odds, we're going to have pair draws, and we're going to have the ability to win big pots in many occasions. So a hand like this is going to be fine to call with. Scanning around for some other draws here, we can see that when we have a bit less equity, a hand like King 10, which has less showdown value than King Jack and less redraw than Jack 10, we're actually going to be on the fence. So that's the frailness threshold there, is a hand like King 10 of hearts. You can see that Queen 10 and hands below that are just having to fold their draw at this point. There's not really enough raising allowed in this spot for you to just raise these hands. Moving on to the next part, we're going to pick 6 hands. Before we do that, where is the robustness threshold with respect to made hands? We can see here that a hand like pocket 8s is just going to be folding, so it seems to be around the vicinity of a fairly bad 7, something like 10-7. You'll note here that the better second pair with the more robust kicker that can actually dominate some of villain's bluff holdings is going to always be calling, but something like 10-7 is going to be mixed calling with folding. We can also see that we much prefer a lower pair on the board, something with a straight draw and also outs to trips or 2 pair, than we do a hand like pocket 8s. Note that 8s is also going to be very bad for blocking lots of bluffs in villain's range. Next up with hand 1, we're going to pick 6 hands and say where each of them fits in the bluff catching system and why. These must be a good mix of frail hands, bluff catchers and value beaters. Pick at least 3 bluff catchers. With respect to frail hands, let's just pick maybe one frail hand first and talk about why it wouldn't be calling here. So a hand like King Queen offsuit is a hand that gets to call the flop bet because at that point in the hand it still has a lot more equity. The turn, after all, could have been a king or a queen. But what's happened here is that the turn is the absolute opposite of that. It's a 4. And what a 4 does is, well, it's not a king or a queen, so this hand is bricked. But it also means that the pair draws that this hand actually has are now less nutty. Hitting a king or a queen if the board is 9-7-3 deuce is much better than if it's 9-7-3-4. This hand, meanwhile, doesn't beat all bluffs because the villain could be bluffing here with a hand like ace-4, ace-5 or ace-deuce. Another hand we could look at here is a grade C bluff catcher. The most obvious grade C bluff catchers that come to mind here is something like ace-queen. The reason this hand is generally just going to be folding is, again, its redraw has got a lot worse on a turn card that creates straights and straight draws for villain's range. Another bluff catcher we could look at could be a grade B1, a hand that's actually mixing call with fold. That would be a hand like 10-7. Ace-3 and King-3 also seem to fit this bill at first sight, but when we look closer, it's actually dependent on whether we have hearts or not, meaning that Ace-3 is actually a grade A bluff catcher when it has a flush draw, and grade C when it doesn't. The problem with this hand is it's blocking some straight draw bluffs, but it's also just very vulnerable to villain's bluffing range, so I class this as grade C and grade A respectively. What is truly grade B then? Something like 10-7 of diamonds, a hand that does have some degree of robustness but is not as robust as a 9. You'll see here that all 9s are grade A bluff catchers. A hand like jacks or 10s here is definitely going to be a value beater, as are the best 9s in our range, and we can see that ace-9 here is going to be raising. When we look at villain's range, we can see that they're betting down to about queen 9 here, and so queen 9 is our worst value beater, jack 9 is our highest up bluff catcher. It's good to get an idea of these thresholds. Let's move on to the second spot now and analyse the river decision against a triple barrel. In hand 2, we'll start by asking how our fold percentage differs from the pot odds norm, and we can see that we're folding now slightly less than that. This is basically negligible. The idea is that we were in a more favourable world, but then villain bet again on the river and triple barreled, and now because villain will have shed their worst combos into the check give up range and won't be bluffing all the time, they're now betting a sensible enough range that we just have a neutral world. This means that we're going to be roughly indifferent with a grade B bluff catcher. What does the bluff catching system look like, and where are the calling thresholds with respect to robust and frail hands? We're not going to be calling any frail hands at this juncture because we're on the river, so we're going to be folding anything here that hasn't actually picked up the ability to beat bluffs, but I don't think we're really going to have many of these holdings in the first place in such a spot. We could in principle get here though with something like King Jack, but that's going to be a straight. We don't really have 2 offsuit cards here with just 1 diamond that aren't going to be a made hand. With robust hands, it's going to be really blocker dependent, and so it's not so useful to think in these terms. What we'd be better doing is grading the bluff catchers. Let's pick 6 hands and say where they are. Starting off with some grade C bluff catchers, hands that you just don't really want to be calling, we could have a hand like this. The reason that a hand like this would not want to be calling is that the 9 is not really blocking any value combos whatsoever here, but the Jack is blocking bluffs in the form of Ace Jack with 1 diamond or King Jack. That's a straight, but yeah, mainly Ace Jack with 1 diamond. The Jack is going to be villains' most principal card when they're bluffing, because they're going to have combos like Ace of Hearts, Jack of Diamonds, Ace of Spades, Jack of Diamonds, etc. But the Jack of Diamonds is going to be a fairly bad card to hold in these situations. When we look at villains' other bluffs here, they're fairly few and far between. There's just certain combos that contain 1 diamond, like Ace 8 offsuit and things like this. Finding a hand now that could count as a bluff catcher that's always folding. Well, we said Jack 9 is grade C. What would be one that's mixing, that's grade B? Very interestingly, and something that came up a lot in the answers to this that I got when I ran this as a live school, was that King Jack of Diamonds is now a bluff catcher, the same as all the other King Jack. The reason for this is that villain's only worst value bet here is going to be a Jack high flush. As you can see, Jack 10, for example, is making this bet. What that means is that when you have a hand like the King 7 of Diamonds, you actually have a value beater because you're beating the Jack 10 value bet. But when you have the King and Jack of Diamonds, you actually block the only hand that would promote your hand into a value beater. Therefore, your hand has become a bluff catcher, not a particularly great one, so you end up just mixing here. As we can see in villain's strategy here, he will be bluffing a lot with the King of Diamonds in his hand with the combo of Ace King. That's why the King Jack of Diamonds is not as positive as it looks. While it does block many of these second nut flush draw combos that do bet the river, it also blocks a few bluffs. Going back to the node where we face the bet now and moving up in the bluff catcher system, a grade A bluff catcher is going to be a hand that only beats bluffs but is always calling. When we look at a hand like 10s with the 10 of Diamonds, we don't have a value beater because villains shouldn't be value betting worse. However, our hand is going to have a very positive blocker. Villain on this node is not really going to be bluffing with an offsuit combo containing the 10 of Diamonds, but they are going to be value betting the Jack 10 of Diamonds, so the 10 of Diamonds is a positive blocker. You see that when we don't have that hand, we're actually mixing call and fold, indicating that the set is just a bluff catcher. It's just that with the diamond it's a class A one and a very good one. Value beaters are few and far between here in our range. They're just really going to be king high flush draws that do not contain the Jack of Diamonds, and if we do get here with a hand like Ace 10, from time to time we of course jam, and we're supposed to mix a bit of Ace Queen in there with Ace of Diamonds in order to balance that. This is a very tricky spot in a pretty rare situation, and while it's really interesting to see what happens to ranges on such wet runouts, I don't think it's a massive deal for your win rate to master such a complex and fiendish situation due to its scarcity with which it comes up. Having done these 2 lectures on bluff catching, guys, we're going to move on from this topic now, and lecture 9 is actually going to be a complete shift towards flop strategy in 3-bet pots. In the next class, we're going to learn how to build a flop strategy in a 3-bet pot small blind versus button by looking at the texture of the flop and then deciding what our range and nut advantage looks like. These things are going to control our bet frequency and sizing. Hope you've enjoyed today's class and that you'll feel a bit more confident when you're facing bets from now on. Onwards and upwards, 3-bet pots next time. See you guys then. Bye for now.